As many of you may have surmised, I have a particular fondness for Jaguars. Now, this is almost a lifelong preference, and one that was cemented early on in my childhood when I first began noticing cars as a thing. I was born in 1967, and so I suppose that I started becoming aware of different types of cars when I was about 5 years old or so, around 1972 or 3. It would have been pointed out to me when I probably asked with interest, "What's that one, Mummy?" "That's a Jag, darling," she would have replied. And all the way back then, Jaguars really were special. There weren't very many sleek foreign cars at the time to dilute that specialness, and compared to Humbers, Morris Minor Travellers, Ford Populars, Standard Vanguards, Austin Cambridges or Maxis that would have been plentiful at the time, Jags, with their long, low, lithe stance, looked like they were from another time, a time that was yet to be. And such preferences, nursed from an early age, I would imagine are far from uncommon. And if you are a boring romantic like me, having what I believe is a beautiful car, like a Jaguar, has always far outweighed the virtues of a reliable, practical or economical one. But this preference has been tested over the years and has come under particular pressure recently, since my current Jag has been off the road and effectively undrivable for 7 whole months with a mysterious and so far unsolvable electrical gremlin. But such irrational preferences, forged at an early age, drive the nostalgia of the classic car market. But sometimes it's also the nostalgia of those glory days when you got your first car and your world began to open up. When you began to be able to explore the world at your leisure, on your own, and without the permission of anyone else, and without being tied to the timetables of public transport. That was the promise of the car, and traffic jams notwithstanding, it was a promise that was delivered by the bucket load for decades. So for many, they yearn after the car they had when they were 18 or 19, but also for better versions of that same car that they couldn't quite afford at that age. So if you had a Ford Escort, now you want an Escort Mexico. If you had a VW Golf, you seek out a Golf GTI. A Vauxhall Astra, only an Astra GTE will suffice. But for still others, it's the cool car that your neighbour, your uncle, or if you were really lucky, your dad had. Being dropped off at school in your dad's Ford Cortina 1600E gave you serious amounts of cool at age 10. And this is the category that my good friend falls into, the car in question being a Triumph Dolomite Sprint. For anybody under the age of 40 or from overseas, the Triumph Dolomite was a compact saloon car, and the Sprint was the high performance version that could feasibly have made Triumph a competitor to BMW. It was highly regarded at the time, but as Triumph was part of the catastrophe that was British Leyland, the communists and the trade unions put pay to that, and Triumph as a brand limped on, latterly making rebadged Hondas until the once proud name was put out of its misery when the plug was finally pulled in 1984. But Triumphs still exist in small numbers, and they are mostly loved and cosseted by their, it has to be said, mostly elderly owners. As it happens, there is a well-worn 1980 version of the even more humble Toledo model in my local town that seems to be the everyday driver of its owner. It's not even really a classic, but merely a very old car. But to somebody like me, it's nice to see it around. And it's even nicer for my friend who continues to search the classifieds in his quest for his Dolly Sprint. And seeing this old clunker was the trigger for him to tell me about how a woman on Facebook was posting pictures of an old Dolomite Sprint that she was proudly announcing was going to be scrapped so that she could get a £2,000 discount on the government's scrappage scheme. And it was obvious from his wounded tone that this was really getting under his skin. He was really aggrieved by it. Why would somebody, he kept saying, scrap something like that just to get £2,000 off a 30 grand car? And why would they announce it with smiles and thumbs up emojis online? And I sympathised, genuinely so, since I wasn't happy about it either. But it got me wondering about where all this emotion was coming from, and it sparked a memory of something that had been on the radio a few years previously. It was a discussion about whether the practice of keeping historic aircraft flying should be brought to a close, and that for some reason, some utterly inexplicable and unexplained reason, this idea appeared to be coming from a woman who had no expertise, knowledge, or even, it seemed, any interest in the subject at hand. She was suggesting that keeping old aircraft flying was, in some very vague sense, dangerous, and that all those old planes should be grounded and put on display in museums. It was on the Jeremy Vine radio show, and to any fortunate overseas listeners, Vine is a particularly insufferable, massively overpaid, virtue signalling, ostentatious bicycle riding BBC personality who makes a hobby out of filming what he considers to be bad driving and putting the clips up on Twitter in hope of getting the driver fined or fired. Which is nice from someone who earns £750,000 a year and would make no material difference to him if he lost his job tomorrow and never got another. So as I was listening to this vapid woman, it became apparent that the only thing that she was interested in was denying pleasure to others. She made no cogent arguments for her position, instead just made meaningless statements like, well, it was all a long time ago, and this is the modern world, and there's really no place for stuff like that anymore, as well as hinting that old stuff was just a bit crap and that there might be accidents. And her statements were so anodyne that I really think that they just put her on as they didn't have anything else to talk about. I think she just worked in the radio station. And as if that weren't bad enough, Vine kept interjecting with her and with the exasperated listeners that phoned in that these old Spitfires were just like Trigger's broom. Again, for overseas listeners, Trigger was a hilariously dim character in the long-running BBC comedy show Only Fools and Horses, who had won an award from the local council for maintaining the same broom for 20 years. A broom that had had only 17 new heads and 14 new handles. What Vine obviously thought was his clever point was that since old aircraft have to be maintained to a tremendously exacting standard, so many parts would have been replaced as per regulations to keep their airworthiness certificates that they cannot honestly be described as historic aircraft. As you can probably understand, the idiocy of this discussion was making me, as well as the constant stream of listeners, many of whom had extensive knowledge of the subject at hand, infuriated. I have a general, as well as a particular interest in this subject. My general interest is that I am British, and the part that Spitfires and Hurricanes played in the maintaining of my, as well as the rest of Europe's freedom, is something that is etched into my very soul. My particular interest is that I'm fortunate to live in an area of Kent where these expertly maintained planes fly over my house multiple times a day, particularly in the summer. And the more I think about that astonishingly moronic debate, the more convinced I am that it was nothing more than an exercise in provocation. The intervening years, particularly with reference to the scam that was Black Lives Matter, have only strengthened this suspicion. It was to get a rise out of us. But scrapping a rusty old Triumph is one thing. Grounding a handful of perfectly maintained, and not to say incredibly valuable, World War II fighter planes is quite another. Very few people, myself and my friend excepted, will be offended about an old Triumph going to the great scrapyard in the sky. But there will be many hundreds of thousands who will be offended about removing those Spitfires from the sky and interring them like aspic forever in museums. But even those hundreds of thousands will still be a minority. But was it still an offended minority when they daubed racist on the statue of Winston Churchill, or when some race-baiting American academic wished an eternity of suffering on the late Queen? Is it a minority who are offended when their blameless children are taught to apologise to other, equally blameless children for the sins of their great grandfathers. Is it only a minority that is offended when they see countless thousands of young men, about whom we know nothing, nothing whatsoever, land on the beach and are put up in four-star hotels, whilst those who are born here, and even those who risk life and limb for this country, are left to sleep on park benches? And is it still only a minority who are offended that perhaps as many as 500,000 children, mostly underage girls, have been, still are, and will continue to be gang raped by groups of British Pakistani men, whilst the politicians, social services and the police look the other way, ignore and even enable it? It may seem quite a link I'm making between the scrapping of an old car and the abusive obliteration of generations of children. It may seem so, and it is obviously a minuscule link. It's probably true to say that the woman gleefully announcing the scrapping of the old Triumph is likely doing so without any kind of malice, at least not a conscious one. But the faux historic aircraft canceller is doing so. The link is there. There is a tiny thread that runs through all of this, a tiny but ultimately a destructive one. It's a determined effort to destroy absolutely everything we hold dear. Everything, from the things that really don't matter all that much, like the old Triumph, to the things that mean literally everything, like our children. This cannot be accidental. There's no way that it can be accidental. If it was accidental, there would be times that the achievements of the West, and Britain in particular, would be noted, acknowledged, and honestly, without jingoism, celebrated. But there never is. All we get is a constant, unrelenting diatribe of how bad we are, how useless, how entitled, how lazy, how unproductive, how racist, of course, and generally how absolutely and irredeemably shit we all are. All nations, as all people, are a mix of the good and the bad. The tyrannical boss might actually be a good businessman who nevertheless brings prosperity. The open, kind and generous soul might be so naive as to be a danger to his immediate kith and kin by advantaging strangers at the expense of those most deserving of his protection. So it is with countries. The French may well occupy perhaps the single most civilised country on earth, but their devotion to the ultimate culinary delights, for instance, blinds them to the most unnecessary cruelty inflicted on animals in the pursuit of that aim. The Swiss may have perhaps the most democratic society on earth, but the lack of scruples in their banking endeavours, the source of much of their considerable wealth that enables such democratic largesse, allow some of the world's most criminal enterprises to continue their damaging activities of drug dealing, arms dealing and sex trafficking. And so it is with Britain. We have been, until recently at least, the source of the majority, that is, more than 50% of all worldwide patents. Inventions, to be more specific. But we seem chronically incapable of capitalising on that ingenuity. We are demonstrably one of the richest societies on earth, and yet that wealth is so unevenly distributed that in many ways the country resembles a banana republic. We have one of the world's oldest and most resilient democracies, and yet we are run by a uniparty where the great issues of the day are agreed upon by all the supposedly distinct parties, and yet are vehemently opposed by the great bulk of the population. We are, in short, a democracy in name only. So these are pretty big negatives I've just highlighted, and they're negatives that I don't like to acknowledge, but acknowledge them I do. And I do so for two reasons. Firstly, and most importantly, because I believe them to be true. But secondly, I do so because I wish to enter the discussion in good faith. I try not to gloss over the bad things in the hope that the other party will see that I am trying to tell the truth and will do likewise. I hope that they will also enter the arena of discussion in the same good faith. I hope that they will respond to the phrase, all immigrants are a net benefit to society, with the same scepticism as the converse, all immigrants are a drain on society. Because quite obviously, neither of those statements are true. I hope that they will. I hope against hope. But it is increasingly apparent that that hope is misplaced. Truth, or more specifically, nuance, is not part of their lexicon. I can't help feeling that an intolerance to nuance is an acknowledgement that their arguments are weak. Nuance seems to be synonymous to doubt, and doubt to weakness. Admitting that not all immigrants are beneficial to a society seems, in their minds, to lead inexorably to the statement that all immigrants are a drain, because anything else would have to lead to the conclusion that at least some controls are necessary. And they cannot admit that, because once the absolute is broken, that of all immigrants are beneficial, then that may lead in turn to more controls, and then still more, and that cannot be allowed to happen. The border must be wide open, and kept so, and one may be forgiven for thinking that their intolerance to nuance is a tactic to get as many immigrants sucked in as possible before anyone has enough balls to withstand being called a racist. But why? Why the rush? Why the urgency to disregard all the previous laws made by serious and sober men in stable times that carefully balance the competing challenges of respecting national boundaries with that of protecting genuine and desperate, and even not so desperate, refugees from the horrors of persecution, famine, war and genocide? Because even a blind man can see that the overwhelming majority of these people are escaping none of those things. Could it be because they are attempting to outnumber us in order to bring their societies here wholesale, without the inconvenience of having to adapt to our way of life? It could be. I couldn't say. And I'm loath to think that these people, en masse, do genuinely wish us harm. I'm loath to think that because I'm ever watchful of the divide and conquer play, which is always what the powerful do when they want to distract us. As I say, I'm loath to think this, but at the same time, a part of me says that this explanation cannot be discounted. A part of me thinks this is a threat that cannot be ignored. Nevertheless, I'm more persuaded by the idea that the flood of particularly illegal immigration, but not forgetting the much more numerous legal immigration, is part of the continued destruction of the West generally, and even more so, the very idea of the West. A supermajority of the British electorate absolutely do not agree with this level of immigration, and yet it continues unabated. Is it just a shadowy superpower for elite in Davos or at the United Nations? At the top, I'm sure that this is the case, but it's the middlemen who are supercharging this. During COVID, it was much more enlightening to follow the money rather than the science to discover the rationale for much of the policies. With regard to immigration, it likewise makes much more sense to ignore the politics and again follow the pound notes. Serco, a company until recently run by the grandson of Winston Churchill no less, is making an absolute killing by having the government contract to house all these immigrants. If the state had the desire to stop the boats, it could do so, and it could do so tomorrow. It is not a question of incompetence. Allowing unfettered mass immigration is policy. Policy that is not yet on the statute books. Policy that is allowing some actors, like Serco, to make obscene profits directly from the taxpayer via government to the detriment of the taxpayer. But this isn't just a question of ethics, although it is certainly that. It's a question of theft. For many, particularly on the right, all taxation is theft. But this really is theft. The likes of Serco, who obviously have the ear of government, are somehow convincing the government that ignoring, undermining and violating well-established laws is just good for business, although it is utterly perverse to count fleecing the taxpayer as anything approaching business. They are making themselves richer whilst making us poorer, and at the same time flooding the country with people who have absolutely zero regard for the country that they are being trafficked into. And zero regard at best. At worst, which I'm not suggesting is the case, but must nevertheless be considered, these may be people who actively despise this country, everything it stands for, and also everybody in it. The degradation that stems from that is also deliberate. So on the one hand, everything about Britain that is unarguably admirable, like being the very first country on earth to ban slavery, is dismissed as an irrelevance. Every achievement, like beating the Nazis, is denigrated as being for nefarious reasons. And every technical advancement, be it relatively lowly Triumphs and Jaguars or freedom-saving Spitfires, is compared unfavourably to what other countries have done. And on the other hand, millions are being imported that don't require their sense of nationhood to be destroyed, since they have no regard or affection for their new home. And into the bargain, they will continue to bring their own previous sense of nationhood with them, and what's more, they will be encouraged to do so. On a macro scale, everything that can be done to destroy and demoralise Britain and the wider West will be done. And the only thing that must be done whilst this is happening is that those doing the demoralisation will be made richer. They will pick our pockets and cry racist if we complain. So this has to be recognised for what it is, demoralisation. And demoralisation is a tactic designed to make you believe that all is lost. That all is lost, and even if it isn't, it doesn't deserve to be saved. Because you don't deserve to be saved. You're a racist. Any prosperity you may have built has been built on the backs of others that you have dominated and enslaved. And you have not dominated and enslaved others because you are better, more advanced, cleverer, or stronger. You're not. You are able to do that because of a number of undeserved and fortunate accidents that even weak and unprincipled idiots like your ancestors couldn't fail to have succeeded with. And now you deserve to be dominated. You're lucky that you are not enslaved, although that may yet come. You deserve to be displaced. You deserve to be pushed out of work by hungrier and harder working immigrants who haven't had your advantages of a welfare state, functioning institutions and the rule of law. Just look at this bloke who's just arrived, penniless, from Libya, and already he is out competing you, and doing it for less. You're pathetic. You deserve to be pushed out of your neighbourhoods and your cities and towns. Eventually we will come for you in your villages. You deserve to die out, in fact. Your sperm count is dropping year after year. You'll need our virility because you are losing yours. The kind of virility that comes with the grooming gangs. That kind. And this happens and the state, your state, does nothing. Do they do nothing because they are afraid of being called racist? No, they do nothing because this is what the state, your state, wants to happen. Because your state is not your state anymore. Your state is run not by you, but by others. Others who want to destroy it. Others who are on our side, not yours. Of course, I paint a dismal picture. Some may call it extreme. But the most extreme things are already happening, and have been happening for some time. But we need to realise and to understand what we are up against. We are at war. Most, as we know, fail to see it. Many more can't bear to look. But we must make them look. We must make them look at it square in the face. This is not about who are the good people and who are the bad. We can demonstrate quite plainly and clearly, as I have mentioned, that we are, as a nation, are good people. But this is an irrelevance. It doesn't matter who's good and who isn't. The British didn't beat the Nazis because they were better than them. They beat them because they were, in the end, simply stronger than them. Ignore those who say that it wasn't the British who beat the Nazis, that it was the Americans, and with more validity, the Russians. The Americans and the Russians fought valiantly, and in the case of Russia, at enormous cost. But the Americans only entered the fray when they were attacked. The Russians would have been our enemies if they hadn't been attacked by their ally. Britain was counted out by many in 1940. It was inevitable, they said, that Britain would have to make peace with Germany. But Britain acted with principle, going to war for an ally, and once in the fray, strained every sinew and paid every cost to prevail. Enormous amounts of treasure was expended to succeed. What was inevitable was, in the end, evitable. But one of the reasons the British came out on top was that they were underestimated. They didn't believe that these English gentlemen had it in them. But they did. And what they also discounted was all those in Britain that weren't English gentlemen. If they had, they might never have dared to go to war with us. But that was all a very, very long time ago. More than 3 generations. It's probably been too long. But if we have a strength, it is that our enemies will once again underestimate us. And by underestimate, I mean that they will overestimate our politeness. Our politeness, not to mention it. They will overestimate our tolerance, our humanity, and our decency. They will overestimate our desire to be called gentlemen and underestimate our willingness to be seen as ruthless, savage, and cruel. Because being a gentleman is a construct, an image, an affectation. In the end, it's not who we really are. Just like everyone else, we're savages underneath. At some point, this veneer of civilization will have to be stripped away and discarded. And since our very survival is at stake, the sooner that day comes, the better.